Randy Moss is one of the most widely known players to ever play in the National Football League. Every kid playing backyard football in the US has heard the phrase, get mossed, and the impact he had on football and sports in general is just absurd. I mean, the man hasn't played a down of football in over a decade, and his last name is still the adjective that people use to describe a spectacular catch. But with all the impact he had on football and all the plays he made in his career, Randy Moss might just be the unluckiest superstar in NFL history. Obviously, there are guys who had career-ending or altering injuries, which are very tragic, but barring anyone who hasn't been able to keep their health during their career, Randy Moss might very well be the unluckiest superstar in the history of the National Football League. Randy Gene Moss was born on February 3, 1977 in Rand, West Virginia, which is a small town that only had a population of around 1,000 people. As a young child, Moss was in love with three sports, being football, baseball, and basketball. And much like most kids growing up in the 1980s and 90s, his childhood idols were Walter Payton and Michael Jordan. Moss started playing basketball in his freshman year of high school at DuPont High, where he played alongside a young man named Jason Williams, also known as White Chocolate, who, if you're a fan of the NBA, would know was one of the flashiest and most well-respected hoopers in the NBA's history. They had been well aware of each other due to competing on the football field growing up in the same areas, but they shared a bond once they became teammates on the field as well as on the court. Both excelled in football and basketball, as Jason Williams won Player of the Year as a quarterback in football one year, and Randy won as a shooting guard in basketball another year, which is pretty funny as they both went pro in different sports, but were just natural athletes. And Jason Williams even said that Randy was the most spectacular athlete he had ever seen in his life. Mind you, this guy also played with the likes of Dwayne Wade, Shaquille O'Neal, and Dwight Howard, who were some of the greatest athletes to grace a basketball court. But Moss had dominated on the football field so much that almost every major college had interest in him, but there was a lot of concern about his character coming into college, and after an arrest in the senior year of college, Moss lost his offer from Notre Dame, as well as being kicked off the football team at FSU for failing a drug test. This caused Randy to have to find a new school to pursue his path to the NFL, but there were no more Power 5 schools that were willing to give Randy a shot. Randy ended up going to Marshall University to finally begin his college football career, and to everyone's surprise but his own, Moss absolutely dominated at Marshall in 1996, putting them on the map and moving them up to Division 1A after leading them to a ring in his freshman season there. In 1997, Moss continued his dominance and was a Heisman finalist that year alongside Peyton Manning and Charles Woodson, who are also both Hall of Famers. But due to the character concerns mentioned earlier, Moss would end up falling to Minnesota at 21, and this would be one of the greatest slides in NFL draft history, as we all know what Moss would end up becoming. But Moss did not take a long time to develop, as he took the league by storm, absolutely dominating right out of the gate. With the Hall of Fame duo of Chris Carter and Moss catching bombs downfield from a rejuvenated Randall Cunningham, the 1998 Minnesota Vikings were an all-time great offense. In the first NFL game of Moss's career, he put up 95 yards and 2 touchdowns versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which would be the start of arguably the greatest rookie year that we have ever seen from a wideout. Moss would put up 190 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 5 against a Packers team that had won the division 3 years in a row and had a prime Brett Favre. This would be the Vikings' 5th win in a row to start the year off, and they had already put up 166 total points in only 5 weeks, and were rewriting the history books on a weekly basis. Minnesota would win 2 more games before dropping a very close one in Tampa Bay, losing 27-24. But all this did was make Minnesota and Moss have one of the best stretches of offensive football the NFL had ever seen, as they put up 45 or more points 3 times in the final 8 games, including Randy Moss's iconic Thanksgiving Day performance, where he caught 3 passes for 163 yards and scored every single time he touched the ball. The Vikings would finish the 1998 regular season with a 15-1 record and looked like they would be the story of the 1998 season and one of the greatest football teams of all time. This would continue to the divisional round as Minnesota hung a casual 41 points on the Cardinals in a 41-21 rout, with Moss putting up 73 yards and a touchdown. But in the next week, versus the Atlanta Falcons, the first sign of brutal misfortune in Moss's career would rear its ugly head. The Vikings seemed to be the scorching offense they had been all year, early on going up 20-7, and could have been up even more if it weren't for a few timely drops, but the Falcons would keep it close until late in the fourth quarter, with the score being 20-27 with Minnesota in the lead. The Vikings drive stalled out, and they would send Gary Anderson, who had not missed a kick the entire season, to kick a field goal to put the Vikings up 10 with 2 minutes remaining, which would all but send the Vikings to Super Bowl 33 versus the Denver Broncos. But Anderson would miss, and the Falcons would go down the field and tie the game up after 2 dropped interceptions by Minnesota DBs that would have ended the game for Atlanta right then and there. And in OT, both teams had nothing going on until the Falcons were able to get a field goal drive late, and their kicker, Morton Anderson, would win the game from 30 yards out to send them to Miami, where they would lose to the 14-2 Denver Broncos that year. But for Randy, it was only his rookie year, and what a rookie year it was. Winning Offensive Rookie of the Year, being All-Pro First Team, and being the best wide receiver on the greatest offense in NFL history. To that point, it seemed like Randy was well on his way to being the greatest receiver in pro football history. But after 1998, Minnesota had a drastic decline. Randall Cunningham went from playing MVP-level football in 1998 to really showing his age in 1999 as he threw 8 touchdowns to 9 interceptions in the first 6 games of the year, and it looked like it was time to hang up his cleats. Cunningham went on to play a few more years as a backup, but Jeff George would come in and be the guy for Minnesota the rest of the year, and while he was solid, he clearly wasn't that guy, and the Vikings would lose in the divisional to the greatest show on turf that year in a blowout that they had turned into a more respectable loss in the fourth quarter when the game was already out of hand. In 2000, the Vikings gave the keys of the organization to their 1999 first-round pick in Dante Culpepper, and Culpepper quickly emerged as one of the best dual-threat QBs in the NFL, and seemed like he could be the elite quarterback that they had missed in 1999. This would prove to be somewhat true, as Moss and Culpepper would lead Minnesota to another division title in 2000, but it was all for nothing, as the Vikings would have one of the most embarrassing playoff losses in NFL history, losing 41-0 to the New York Giants, who ended up getting embarrassed just as badly in the Super Bowl versus the Ravens. This would start the downward spiral of the Vikings-Moss era, as he continued to be excellent year in and year out, and be one of the great talents that we had ever seen, with spectacular catch after spectacular catch, but after missing the playoffs for 3 years in a row and then a disappointing loss to the Eagles in 2004, a week after this iconic moment by Randy Moss.
Being able to run as he shoots the moon to the fans here in Green Bay.
That is a disgusting act by Randy Moss.
Moss, as a Minnesota Viking, had one of the most iconic runs with the team in sports history and is still second in most major receiving categories for the franchise. And if he had played more years of his prime in Minnesota, he would have shattered all of Cris Carter's records. However, 2004 would be his last season in Minnesota for the foreseeable future, and the Vikings decided it was time to cut their losses and move into a new era of Vikings football. They traded Moss to the Oakland Raiders for a first rounder, a 7th rounder, and Raiders linebacker Napoleon Harris. Honestly, Randy Moss on the Raiders is one of the weirder stints in the NFL's history. As in Oakland, Moss would still be one of the premier wideouts in the National Football League, but his production dropped off, and a lot of the time it seemed like it was due to a lack of effort. The Raiders in 2005 were atrocious, as they went 4-12 in Moss's first season with the team with Kerry Collins under center. Moss still put up 1,000 yards this season, but he felt as though he was wasting away with the Raiders and started to grow very unhappy. Moss in 2006 was at a breaking point, probably playing the worst football of his career, but he really did not have much to work with, as Aaron Brooks and Andrew Walter threw for a combined 6 touchdowns to 21 interceptions on the season, and the Raiders had one of the worst offensive situations in NFL history that year, only averaging 10.5 points per game, which was good for worst in the league, as well as going 2-14, good for the first overall pick in that year's draft. Funny enough, they ended up drafting Jamarcus Russell, but Randy wouldn't be sticking around to see that fiasco play out, as both the Raiders and Moss knew it was time for something to give, and Bill Belichick and the Patriots had a vision and decided to pull the trigger on draft day 2007, trading a 4th rounder in that year's draft for Randy Moss. To put into perspective why Randy Moss was given to New England for a bag of chips, he was coming off a year where he was dealing with nagging injuries, as well as the fact that there really wasn't a moment where that Raiders offense looked competent at all. Oakland was really ready to rebuild after their unintentional tanking the last 2 seasons. And if you have followed the NFL for a while or just know about the careers of Tom Brady and Randy Moss, you would know that this would be one of the greatest value trades in NFL history. Brady finally had his number 1 guy who could help them reach the mountaintop once again, and Moss had the best quarterback in the NFL throwing to him. It was a match made in heaven, and the 2007 Patriots had one of the most unforgettable seasons in NFL history. If you thought the 1998 Vikings team was historically great, which they were, this Patriots team was in a different stratosphere. The Patriots famously went 16-0, and Tom Brady set the record for most passing touchdowns in an NFL season with 50, and 23 of those happened to be to Randy Moss, which was also an NFL record, breaking Jerry Rice's 20-year-old record of 22 receiving touchdowns. In 2007, the Patriots were untouchable and were yet to lose a Super Bowl to that point. So imagine what winning 4 out of 4 Super Bowls and going 19-0 to get the 4th would have done for the Patriots, Tom Brady, and Bill Belichick's legacies at the time. But we wouldn't be here if the Patriots walked off into sunset after winning a Super Bowl, now would we? The sign started in the divisional round, as even though Brady played a flawless game versus Jacksonville, Moss really only had one catch for 14 yards after a masterpiece versus the Giants 2 weeks before to set the record for receiving touchdowns in a season. And this would continue in the AFC Championship game, as the Chargers got dangerously close to beating New England, but ultimately could not score after cutting the Patriots' lead to 2. And this would mean that the New England Patriots, who are now 18-0, would be going on to face the New York Giants, who barely made the playoffs in 2007. No one expected the Giants to win, and the Pats were 12-point favorites. But Vegas has never been more wrong, as the first 3 quarters of the game really didn't have too much action, but the 4th quarter was one of the greatest in Super Bowl history. Manning hit David Tyree to go up 10-7, but then Brady found Moss in the end zone to put the Patriots up 14-10. And this would be the score until the final Giants drive of the game. Asante Samuel had one of the easiest interceptions of all time, but he dropped it, and then Manning went on to make one of the greatest escapes and throws in Super Bowl history that David Tyree's helmet caught to keep the Giants alive. And after another almost interception, the Giants went down the field and scored, hitting Plaxico Burress from 13 yards out. With 30 seconds left, Brady threw a few bombs downfield to Moss, but none were completed, and the Patriots lost Super Bowl 42, and Moss lost another heartbreaker. The Patriots and Moss seemed like they would be primed to come back next year and set the league on fire once again, but in the very first game of the 2008 NFL season, Tom Brady would tear his ACL and MCL and would be out for the entire 2008 season. Moss would have 2 more seasons of elite play in New England before bouncing around for a few years and being relegated to minimal snaps as his age was catching up with him, but he ended up having another heartbreaker before retiring, this time being in Super Bowl 47. Now, to put it into perspective for you guys, in comparison to 1998 and 2007, Moss was nowhere near the impact player he was for the Niners in 2012. But man, did he have some bad luck, as the 49ers had a great run in the NFC that year and stormed all the way back down 22 points at one point in the 3rd quarter of Super Bowl 47 before an incredible comeback. After a 15-yard run from Colin Kaepernick to make the score 29-31, the 49ers just needed a 2-point conversion to tie the game at 31 apiece, but a botched fade on the goal line to Randy Moss from Kaepernick that sailed too high caused them to come away from the drive down 2 still. The Niners got the ball back down 34-29, and after a huge Frank Gore run, they had a chance to go up with around 2 minutes remaining on the goal line, but the Ravens defense held up and the Niners came away with no points, losing Super Bowl 47, which would be the final game of Randy Moss's career. He left the game finishing 3rd in all-time receiving yards, 2nd in all-time receiving touchdowns, and was one of the biggest game changers at the wide receiver position the NFL had and will ever see. It truly is a shame that the man never got to win a ring, especially with 2 real chances in the Super Bowl in that 1998 loss, which would have been a great shot if they escaped that NFC title game. But some things just aren't meant to be, and honestly, it's really a shame, like I said, but this was an interesting one to make, and I hope y'all enjoyed it too. If you did enjoy the video and you're new here, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on those post notifications so you never miss a video. Be easy. LLE out.